In the summer of 1965, a young social worker named Margaret Henley drove down a dirt road in rural Kentucky that didn't appear on any map. She was following reports of children who had never learned to speak, not because they couldn't, but because no one in their family had spoken a complete sentence in over a century. What she found behind the rusted gate of the Whitman property would haunt her for the rest of her life. The children communicated only through grunts and primitive gestures. Their eyes were too close together. Their skulls were misshapen, and when Margaret asked the oldest member of the family about their condition, the woman simply pointed to a family portrait hanging crooked on the wall. 7 generations of faces that looked disturbingly identical, as if the same person had been photographed over and over across 140 years. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story begins in 1823 when Jeremiah Whitman purchased 847 acres of isolated land in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The deed, which still exists in the Harlan County Courthouse, shows that Jeremiah paid just $37 for property that other settlers had refused to touch. The land was considered cursed by the Cherokee, who had lived there before them, and local farmers whispered that nothing good would ever grow in that hollow between the mountains. Jeremiah didn't care about superstitions. He was a religious man who believed that isolation from the outside world would protect his family from sin. He built a cabin deep in the woods, accessible only by a single winding path that he deliberately kept hidden from travelers. His wife Sarah bore him 12 children in that cabin, far from doctors, far from neighbors, far from anyone who might question the choices they were about to make. When their eldest son Thomas reached marrying age in 1845, there were no suitable wives within 50 miles of their property. The nearest town was a 3-day journey through treacherous mountain passes. Rather than venture into the outside world, Jeremiah made a decision that would echo through 7 generations. He encouraged Thomas to marry his own sister, Rebecca. The wedding ceremony was conducted by Jeremiah himself, who had declared himself a minister of his own invented faith. No official records exist of this union because no government official was present to witness it. But the family Bible, discovered decades later by investigators, contains an entry in Jeremiah's own handwriting. Thomas wed to Rebecca, both pure of blood and spirit, sealed before God in holy union, May 15, 1845. Rebecca gave birth to 4 children between 1846 and 1852. 3 survived infancy, though neighbors who occasionally spotted them from a distance reported that they appeared strange and not quite right. The children rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of their family's land, and when they did, they communicated primarily through gestures and primitive sounds rather than words. By 1850, the pattern was established. The Whitman family had become a closed genetic loop, with brothers marrying sisters, cousins marrying cousins, and uncles marrying nieces. They justified this practice through their twisted interpretation of biblical scripture, claiming that God intended for them to keep their bloodline pure from the contamination of outsiders. The first signs of genetic deterioration appeared in the 3rd generation around 1875. Children born to the family began displaying what local doctors would later describe as profound developmental abnormalities. Their skulls were elongated and narrow. Their eyes sat too close together, giving them an unsettling, almost predatory appearance. Most disturbing of all, their capacity for speech had begun to disappear. Dr. Edmund Carruthers, the only physician brave enough to venture onto Whitman property during this period, kept detailed notes that were discovered in his personal effects after his death in 1923. His observations paint a disturbing picture of genetic collapse in real time. The children grunt and gesture like animals, he wrote in his journal dated September 12, 1876. They seem to understand simple commands, but I have not heard a single one speak a complete word. The oldest boy, who appears to be about 16, communicates only through pointing and making guttural sounds deep in his throat. What Dr. Carruthers witnessed was the systematic destruction of the family's ability to process language. Inbreeding had damaged the areas of their brains responsible for speech development and linguistic comprehension. Each successive generation showed more severe impairment, as if their DNA was slowly erasing the very qualities that made them human. The family had developed their own primitive form of communication, a series of grunts, gestures, and facial expressions that allowed them to convey basic needs and emotions. An older family member might point to their mouth and make a low moaning sound to indicate hunger. Children would tug on their parents' clothing and grunt urgently when they needed to relieve themselves. Complex thoughts and abstract concepts had become impossible to express. By the 1880s, the Whitman family had essentially reverted to a pre-linguistic state. They lived like intelligent animals, capable of basic problem-solving and emotional responses, but unable to participate in the fundamental human experience of language. Their world had shrunk to immediate physical needs: food, shelter, reproduction, and survival. Neighbors who lived miles away began reporting strange sounds echoing through the mountains at night. Not quite human voices, but not animal cries either. These haunting vocalizations became part of local folklore. Parents would warn their children never to wander too close to Whitman Hollow after dark, claiming that the sounds could drive listeners mad if heard for too long. The fourth generation, born in the 1890s, marked a turning point in the family's genetic decline. Physical deformities that had been subtle in previous generations now became impossible to ignore. Children were born with cleft palates so severe that even their primitive grunting became difficult. Their limbs developed at uneven rates, leaving some with arms significantly longer than their legs, others with hands that resembled claws more than human appendages. Census records from 1900 provide a chilling snapshot of the family's condition. The official count listed 14 individuals living on the Whitman property, ranging in age from infant to elderly, but the census taker noted in the margins that he was unable to obtain coherent responses from any family members. He described the experience as deeply unsettling and recommended that future census efforts bypass the property entirely. What the census taker had witnessed was a family that had lost not only their ability to communicate with the outside world, but also their capacity to maintain basic human hygiene and social behaviors. The children ran naked through the woods, their bodies covered in dirt and scars from fights with each other over food. They had developed a pack mentality, with the strongest members of each generation asserting dominance over weaker siblings through violence and intimidation. The family's isolation had become complete. They no longer ventured into nearby towns for supplies, instead surviving on whatever they could hunt, forage, or grow in their increasingly barren garden plots. Their diet consisted primarily of wild animals they could catch with their bare hands: rabbits, squirrels, and occasionally larger prey that they would tear apart and consume raw, having lost the knowledge of how to properly cook meat. Local authorities had become aware of the situation but were reluctant to intervene. The Whitman property sat in a legal grey area between counties, and no sheriff wanted to take responsibility for what they privately acknowledged was a family that had devolved beyond help. There were whispered discussions about forced sterilization or removal of the children, but these conversations never progressed beyond speculation. By 1905, the family had developed their own primitive social structure based entirely on physical strength and reproductive capability. The strongest male would claim the most fertile females, regardless of their familial relationship. Weaker members were pushed to the edges of the group, forced to scavenge for scraps, and often dying of neglect or exposure during harsh mountain winters. The fifth generation, emerging in the 1920s, represented perhaps the most tragic chapter in this genetic nightmare. These children were born into a world where human language had become completely extinct within their family line. They had no concept that complex communication was even possible. To them, the grunts and gestures they used were the natural and complete range of human expression. Dr. Helena Morrison, a psychiatrist from the University of Kentucky, managed to observe the family secretly from a distance in 1924. Her field notes, discovered in university archives in 1987, describe children who moved and behaved more like a pack of wild dogs than human beings. They hunt in groups, she wrote, with the younger ones learning by mimicking the older ones. I watched them corner and kill a deer using nothing but coordination and brute force. The youngest, perhaps 7 years old, bit into the animal's throat while it was still alive. The family's reproductive patterns had become increasingly chaotic and disturbing. With no understanding of social taboos or family relationships, children began reproducing as soon as they reached physical maturity. Fathers mated with daughters, mothers with sons, siblings with siblings, all without any awareness that these relationships violated fundamental human norms. To them, reproduction was simply another biological function, like eating or sleeping. The physical deterioration continued to accelerate. Children of the 5th generation were frequently born with severe mental disabilities, missing limbs or organs that functioned improperly. Many died within their first few years of life, their bodies simply unable to sustain themselves. The few who survived to adulthood did so through a kind of savage natural selection that rewarded only the most physically resilient. Local legends from this period describe encounters with family members who had wandered off their property. A traveling salesman reported being attacked by a creature that looked human but moved like a wild animal and made sounds like a wounded bear. A group of hunters claimed to have seen children with eyes that glowed in the dark, watching them from the tree line, communicating through a series of clicks and whistles that sent chills down their spines. The family's original cabin had long since fallen into ruin. The 5th generation lived in crude shelters made from branches, animal hides, and salvaged materials. They had lost the knowledge of basic construction techniques, fire-making, and tool creation. Their ancestors' attempt to preserve racial purity had instead stripped away every advancement that separated humans from wild animals. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The 6th generation, born in the 1940s and 1950s, pushed the boundaries of what could still be considered human. These children exhibited genetic damage so severe that many struggled with basic motor functions. Their brains had developed abnormally, leaving them with intelligence levels that researchers would later compare to those of higher primates, but without the natural instincts that allow animals to thrive in the wild. World War II brought increased government attention to remote areas of Appalachia as military recruiters searched for eligible young men. In 1943, a recruitment officer named Lieutenant James Hartwell became the first official government representative to set foot on Whitman property in over 50 years. His report, classified until 1978, describes an encounter that left him questioning his own sanity. I discovered approximately 20 individuals living in conditions that can only be described as subhuman, Hartwell wrote in his official report. They showed no recognition of my uniform or authority. Several of the younger ones approached me on all fours, sniffing at my boots and making sounds I cannot adequately describe in writing. When I attempted to communicate, pointing to myself and saying, "American soldier," they tilted their heads like confused dogs and began mimicking my gestures without any apparent understanding. The lieutenant's report triggered a secret investigation by the Department of Health and Human Services. A team of researchers, geneticists, and social workers was assembled to study what they internally referred to as the Kentucky situation. Their findings, contained in a 847-page classified document, painted a picture of genetic catastrophe unlike anything previously documented in American history. The 6th generation had developed physical characteristics that seemed to defy human evolution. Their skulls had elongated to accommodate brains that, while enlarged, functioned at a fraction of normal capacity. Their limbs had grown disproportionately, giving them a spider-like appearance that unsettled even seasoned researchers. Most disturbing of all, they had begun developing what appeared to be vestigial tails, small bony protrusions at the base of their spines that suggested their DNA was somehow reverting to an earlier evolutionary state. The family's social structure had collapsed entirely. There were no recognizable family units, no division of labor, no sharing of resources. Each individual existed in a state of constant competition with every other individual, fighting over food, shelter, and mating opportunities with an intensity that bordered on psychotic. The seventh and final generation began appearing in the early 1960s, just as the civil rights movement was transforming American society. These children represented the ultimate consequence of 140 years of genetic isolation, human beings who had been stripped of nearly everything that made them human, yet who somehow continued to survive in their mountain prison. Margaret Henley's arrival in 1965 marked the beginning of the end for the Whitman bloodline. As a social worker specializing in child welfare cases, she had dealt with neglect, abuse, and poverty throughout rural Kentucky. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what she discovered in that hidden hollow between the mountains. Her first encounter with the family occurred on a sweltering July morning. She had parked her car at the end of the overgrown dirt road and walked nearly 2 miles through dense forest before reaching the remains of what had once been a homestead. The structures she found barely qualified as shelters: crude lean-tos made from rotting wood, rusted metal sheets, and animal bones arranged in patterns that seemed to serve some primitive ritualistic purpose. The children emerged from these shelters like wild animals responding to the presence of an intruder. Margaret counted 11 individuals, ranging from what appeared to be infants to elderly adults, though their severe deformities made accurate age assessment nearly impossible. Their movements were coordinated but inhuman. They approached her in a semicircle, making low humming sounds that seemed to communicate information about her threat level. What shocked Margaret most was not their appearance, though that was disturbing enough, but their complete lack of curiosity about her presence. Normal children, even neglected ones, would have shown some interest in her clothing, her car, or the supplies she carried. These children examined her with the same detached assessment that predators use to evaluate potential prey. They showed no fear, no excitement, no recognition that she represented a world beyond their isolated existence. Margaret's attempts at communication met with total incomprehension. When she spoke, they tilted their heads and made clicking sounds with their tongues. When she offered them food from her bag, they snatched it away and immediately began fighting over it, with the strongest members of the group claiming the largest portions. There was no sharing, no cooperation, no acknowledgement that they were part of a family unit. Most heartbreaking of all was her realization that these children had no concept of their own humanity. They had never seen mirrors, never heard music, never experienced the basic human pleasures of storytelling or play. Their world consisted entirely of survival instincts and biological needs. Margaret Henley's report triggered the largest humanitarian intervention in Kentucky state history. Within 6 weeks of her initial visit, a joint task force comprising social workers, medical professionals, geneticists, and law enforcement officers descended upon the Whitman property. What they found there would haunt every person involved for the rest of their lives. The operation, codenamed Mountain Recovery, was conducted in complete secrecy. Government officials were terrified that public knowledge of the family's condition would trigger panic about genetic contamination or inspire copycat isolation communities. The children were removed from the property on August 15, 1965, and immediately transported to a specialized medical facility in Lexington that had been cleared of all other patients. Dr. Robert Steinberg, the lead geneticist on the case, later described the children as living fossils of human devolution. Blood tests revealed genetic abnormalities so severe that they challenged existing understanding of human DNA's resilience limits. The children's chromosomes showed damage patterns that suggested their genetic code was literally unraveling, with each successive generation inheriting increasingly corrupted biological instructions. Attempts at rehabilitation proved largely futile. The younger children, those under 10 years of age, showed limited capacity for learning basic hygiene and simple gestures, but their brains had developed in such abnormal ways that complex learning remained impossible. They could be taught to use toilets and eat with rudimentary utensils, but language acquisition, abstract thinking, and emotional development were permanently beyond their reach. The older members of the 7th generation were deemed beyond any possibility of integration into normal society. They remained institutionalized for the rest of their lives, living in specialized facilities where they were studied by researchers trying to understand the outer limits of human genetic damage. Most died before reaching age 40, their bodies simply unable to sustain themselves as the accumulated genetic errors finally overwhelmed their biological systems. The Whitman property was quietly seized by the federal government and declared a biological hazard zone. All structures were burned, the land was fenced off, and official records of the family's existence were classified or destroyed. The few researchers and social workers who had direct contact with the family were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that remained in effect until their deaths. Today, the hollow between the mountains sits empty and forgotten. Local residents have developed their own folklore about the area, claiming that the land remains cursed and that strange sounds can still be heard echoing through the trees on quiet nights. But the truth is far more disturbing than any ghost story. The Whitman family represents proof that human civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe, and that the line between humanity and something else entirely can be crossed in just a few generations of isolation and genetic damage. Their story serves as a warning about the consequences of extremism, isolation, and the dangerous belief that purity can be preserved through the destruction of diversity. In trying to create something perfect, Jeremiah Whitman had instead created something that was no longer recognizably human at all.